Joining us now from Capitol Hill, member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Independent Senator Angus King of Maine. Thank you for being on the show this morning.
Good morning, Mika.
I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about what's going on today. We saw your contentious frustration, which, by the way, nobody thought was rude last week when you couldn't get any answers out of Coates and Rogers. DNI head Dan Coates and NSA head Mike Rogers. Coates is testifying in closed session today with your committee. What are you hoping to hear from him, and do you think more answers will be forthcoming?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, Mika, but I'm not going to talk about either who's coming before the committee or what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to have to pass on that one. Just know that the committee is continuing to work. And by the way, we have responsibilities beyond this investigation. People think this is all we're doing, it's all the Congress is doing. But as you noted a few minutes ago, we passed a resolution on Russian sanctions in the full Senate yesterday, and our committee has other responsibilities. So there's lots going on here aside from this investigation, but clearly that's the main focus of our work.
Got it. John Heilman.
Senator John Heilman here. I want to pick up on what Mika asked without talking about what's going on today. She noted that you expressed frustration with DNI head Coates and with the head of the NSA last week. You also expressed the same frustration with Attorney General Sessions this week, pointing out that the questions they weren't answering, that they couldn't cite a legal basis for their refusal to answer. So I want to ask you, you didn't get answers that satisfied you. That was clear. What is the recourse that your committee has when you're faced with situations like that? I know people talk about contempt of Congress as one possible thing that you could do. Just explain to us what you can do when you're faced with that kind of intransigence.
Well, as you no doubt suspect, I've done a fair amount of research on executive privilege over the last couple of weeks. And usually what happens in these situations, John, is a negotiation, some kind of negotiation about what you want answered, which are the questions, what's the specific information, what are the documents. There can be lawsuits and contempt of Congress. Those are rarely used. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get the answers to our questions. I was frustrated because when you say I'm going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, the basic premise is you're going to tell everything you know, and if you aren't, there has to be some legal basis for that.
Right.
And Mr. Sessions was asserting, I call it son of executive privilege. I mean, the president is the only one that can assert it. He didn't. And therefore, I thought the question should be answered.
Well, right. And I'll just follow up and ask you, I mean, you said you've been doing a lot of research on executive privilege. The interesting thing in all three of those cases was that none of the men in question actually were asserting executive privilege. They were asserting something else that was a little unclear exactly what they were asserting. So, again, I come back to the question, are you making progress, at least in terms of, I know you don't want to talk about what's going on today behind closed doors, but in terms of the negotiation that you just stipulated as the way these things normally work out, are those negotiations proceeding apace in a way that you find fruitful?
Well, let me just say there have been follow-up conversations. We have gotten some further information, and I think that's as far as I want to go at this point.
All right.
Mike Barnacle.
So, Senator, let's pretend that we're back in Brunswick, Maine, okay? And it's this weekend, and you're walking down Main Street, and a guy comes up to you and says, "Hey, Angus, I see you on TV this week. You know, you look pretty good. You look great, man. But there's one thing I don't understand. You know, you're talking to the Attorney General of the United States, and I just graduated from high school, not college. I'm not a constitutional scholar. But is there a clause in the Constitution, the inappropriate clause, where he keeps saying it'd be inappropriate for me to answer that? How come he won't answer your questions? What do you tell that person?
Well, you know, it's funny you should put it that way, because a friend of mine called me after those hearings and he said, you know, if I came home late at night with the car all dented in and my father said, what the hell happened? And I said, I don't think it's appropriate for me to answer that question. It wouldn't go very far. And that's essentially what was going on. And that was what was, I think, was inappropriate. You either have to have a legal basis, or, as I said, the premise is the whole truth. That means everything you know. And if you aren't going to tell everything you know, then what's the excuse? What's the privilege? And Jeff Sessions was asserting a kind of prospective executive privilege, even though I asked him explicitly, did the president invoke executive privilege in this case? He said no. And he also, in his testimony, said only the president can assert executive privilege. So that was what was that was what was troubling about that testimony. The other thing that was troubling, though, that it didn't get as much publicity, I asked him, did you ever get a briefing on what the Russians did? Did you seek a briefing? Did you ask about it? And he said, no, I only know what I read in the papers. This is the most serious attack on the United States since September 11th, and the chief law enforcement officer doesn't seem very interested in it. And Director Comey said he had 9 conversations with the president. He never asked about, you know, what's your evidence? How do you know what happened? How did they do it? How did we prevent it? I find that as, you know, a pretty disturbing question about something that's really very serious and is going to be serious in the coming years.
Mark Halperin.
Well, Senator, on that point, the intelligence community seems to have reached a pretty broad and uniform conclusion that the Russians interfered with the election and that they did it to try to help Donald Trump win the election. Do you think the president and his administration should accept that conclusion, or do you understand their seeming desire to try to cast doubt on it?
Well, I understand they're being defensive about it, and I understand the concern about was there cooperation or collusion. And by the way, that's not been determined. But the underlying question of what they did, everybody in this place should be concerned about, whatever their party is. As various members of the Republican side in our committee keep pointing out, Putin is not a Republican. This could be turned around in 2 years or in 4 years. And the president should be, you know, obviously some concerns about what involved in his campaign had, but he ought to be concerned about what the Russians did and the danger to our democracy. They were going into state election systems. I mean, this is scary stuff.
All right, Senator Angus King, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Indeed.
Coming up.